What follows draws on federal court records, contemporary news reporting, and verified historical sources. Where outcomes were decided in court, we state them as such. Where accounts conflict or evidence is incomplete, we'll say so. Bronx and Harlem, the late 1980s and early 1990s, crack had turned street corners into a cash economy, and the money moving through those corners needed protection no badge could offer. Storefront gates came down early, corner lookouts clocked every car that didn't belong. Whole blocks ran on an unwritten set of rules that had nothing to do with the ones printed in any statute book, and into that vacuum stepped a man most of his own neighborhood couldn't fully describe because that was exactly how he wanted it. Clarence Heatley was born around 1953 and raised in Harlem. By multiple biographical accounts, he left school by the 4th grade and had a record of arrests for robbery and firearms possession going back to his teenage years. None of that made him unusual for the neighborhood. Plenty of young men in that world carried the same kind of record. What made Heatley different came later, and it wasn't his rap sheet, it was his restraint. He went by Preacher. Later, as his reputation grew, associates and investigators alike also called him the Black Hand of Death. Prosecutors say he built his entire organization around a single principle: don't be seen and you can't be stopped. While other Harlem figures of that era became local celebrities, known faces, known cars, known corners, Heatley worked to become something closer to a rumor with a payroll. Around 1983, Heatley founded what investigators would later call the Preacher Crew. Some called it simply the Family, a Bronx and Harlem operation moving cocaine, crack, heroin, and PCP. That same year, he met the man who would become his top lieutenant, John Cuff, then still a New York City Housing Authority police officer. Cuff worked as Heatley's driver and enforcer even before he left the department, and prosecutors say he brought a cop's sense of discipline and insulation to an organization built to survive contact with law enforcement. It wasn't Cuff's first brush with violent accusations either. He had been charged with murder in Baltimore back in 1989, a case that ended in acquittal after a witness changed testimony. To investigators who encountered him a decade later, that pattern would look familiar. The Preacher Crew's business model wasn't just selling drugs, it was extortion. Dealers paid Heatley's people for the right to operate at all, sometimes thousands of dollars at a time, less a fee than a private tax on an entire underground economy. It was kidnapping used as leverage against people the organization judged too valuable to simply kill. And when someone crossed the organization outright, prosecutors say the response was murder, carried out by trusted shooters and followed by cleanup crews investigators called janitors, men whose job began only after the killing was done, and who, according to some accounts, marked the road with a shared tattoo, a bucket and mop dripping blood. The organization didn't reserve that discipline for outsiders. Prosecutors say that when Heatley came to see his own chief enforcer, Anthony Boatwright, as a threat to his authority, he had Boatwright killed too. The message was aimed inward as much as outward. No one inside the Preacher Crew, no matter how trusted, stood above the rules everyone else lived under. By the early 1990s, the NYPD and FBI had formed a joint task force specifically to take the Preacher Crew down, eventually pulling in agents from the FBI, the DEA, and the IRS alongside NYPD detectives, a scale of resources usually reserved for organized crime families, not a single Harlem drug crew. The obstacle wasn't a lack of violence to investigate. Prosecutors would eventually link the organization to more than 40 homicides across roughly a decade. The obstacle was Heatley himself. He rarely appeared where evidence could reach him, and the fear his organization generated made witnesses disappear before they could testify. Building a racketeering case against a man like that meant doing something local homicide detectives, working case by case, had never had the tools to do, proving a pattern, not just a single crime scene. The cost of that fear wasn't only measured in bodies. Every unsolved killing tied to the Preacher Crew left behind people who had to keep living on the same blocks where it happened, families who learned to ask fewer questions, neighbors who saw enough to know they should say less, not more. That silence was the organization's real infrastructure. It didn't need every resident of Harlem to be afraid of Clarence Heatley personally. It only needed enough of them to stay quiet, that no single case could ever be built past a reasonable doubt. That fear cut both ways though, and eventually worked against Heatley. According to court records, once an inside member of the crew was arrested and began cooperating, Heatley and several associates, Cuff among them, were stopped by police while allegedly attempting to intercept that cooperating witness outside a courthouse. It was a kind of overreach that hands prosecutors exactly the pattern they need, an organization willing to obstruct justice in the open, not just commit crimes in the shadows. From that point on, the case stopped being about isolated killings and started being about an enterprise, which mattered because federal racketeering law exists precisely to reach the person giving orders, not just the person pulling the trigger. On July 15, 1996, a federal grand jury indicted Clarence Heatley on an initial 3 counts of murder and conspiracy to murder and aid of racketeering activity. He was arrested less than a month later, on August 12th. That was only the beginning. By November of 1996, prosecutors had unsealed a far larger 47-count federal indictment charging Heatley and 17 associates, including Lieutenants Derek Hillstock and Paul Weller, with narcotics trafficking, 11 murders, and 11 separate murder conspiracies. The Within days, the majority of those named were already in custody. A year later, in December of 1997, an even broader 86-count indictment followed, naming Heatley as the principal organizer of a continuing criminal enterprise built on murder, narcotics trafficking, extortion, and arson. The same federal charge used to reach mafia bosses and cartel leaders who never touched the product or pulled the trigger themselves. What followed was a slow dismantling from the inside. In a case built this way, prosecutors rarely win from the outside in. They win when the pressure on the people closest to the boss becomes worse than the fear of him. Investigators turned that pressure onto Heatley's own circle, looking for the associates most likely to cooperate rather than face the same exposure Heatley did. One by one, according to court records, they found him, and as the broader indictments moved through the system, a wave of guilty pleas and convictions followed among the associates named alongside Heatley, the same pattern that breaks nearly every organization built this way. The boss survives only as long as the people under him are more afraid of him than of prison. By 1998, prosecutors had filed formal notice that they intended to seek the death penalty against both Cuff and Heatley, first Cuff in January, then Heatley himself that August. Facing capital charges of his own, Heatley retained defense attorneys Joel S. Cohen and David A. Runke. On February 5th, 1999, facing that possibility, Clarence Heatley pleaded guilty. In exchange for the government withdrawing its notice to seek the death penalty, Heatley admitted to racketeering, to running a continuing criminal enterprise built on narcotics trafficking and extortion, and to his role in 13 murders. Weeks later, on March 22nd, his co-defendant John Cuff took his own plea, admitting to participation in 10 killings carried out in aid of the same racketeering enterprise. On June 4th, 1999, Judge Michael B. Mukasey sentenced Clarence Heatley to life in prison plus 225 years, not one number but many, stacked consecutively across the murder, firearms, and criminal enterprise counts he'd admitted to, so that no single vacated charge could ever add up to freedom. That should have been the end of the story. It isn't quite. Clarence Heatley is still alive. Federal records show he's held at FCI Talladega, a medium security prison in Alabama, and he has kept fighting his conviction from inside it. In 2019, he filed a motion under the First Step Act seeking a reduced sentence. The court denied it in 2021. In October of 2024, Senior Judge Loretta A. Preska, whose initials still mark the docket today, denied a further motion from Heatley to vacate his sentence entirely. More than 25 years after his plea, the case that ended the Preacher Crew is still technically open on a docket somewhere in the Southern District of New York. Heatley's name rarely makes headlines now. He was never the kind of boss who wanted a headline in the first place. But in the neighborhoods where the Preacher Crew operated, prosecutors and residents alike say the fear his organization built outlasted the organization itself. It survived not because Clarence Heatley was seen, but because for years almost no one could say for certain that he wasn't watching. For Preacher, that was always the point. It was never really about being known. It was about being believed.